What an incredible week it's been. We've had Facebook turn off the tap to Australian news and then turn back on the tap. But the question is, who gave up what in order for the news to be back on Facebook? Did the media, did the Australian government, or did Facebook have to compromise? And at this stage, it's kind of not overly clear. Our guests this week on Download This Show are Claire Riley from CNET and Jocelyn Brewer, the founder of Digital Nutrition. So laid out for me, do we have a sense of who won and who lost here?
The news dropped that Facebook was sort of tentatively returning news to its platform. They released a statement. Josh Frydenberg, the Australian Treasurer, released a statement, and everyone was kind of doing that that Spider-Man, the multiple Spider-Mans pointing at each other meme, being like, did you win? Did you win? I don't know what the situation is here. It's hard to imagine that Facebook would have capitulated in a way that didn't see them winning some ground, because this isn't just an Australian battle for them. This sets a precedent which could potentially roll out across the world. So it appears Facebook won some concessions. The government was definitely positioning it as a win on their side. The government essentially proposed a number of amendments to its news media bargaining code that would adjust some of the language, and Facebook was happy with that. Obviously, with all legislation, it's how it's put into place, it's how it's enacted and how it exists in the real world once it passes Parliament. So that will be the measure of this bargaining code as well, I think.
I think it's a tricky one because it depends what you're measuring your wins or losses by. I guess all the people who didn't put their too many eggs of their marketing, into the Facebook basket has won and own their own email newsletters and are across different channels. I think what we are discovering as humans is how much our dependence is on Facebook as that, one-stop shop for all the different things in our digital diet, and that we maybe need to diversify and come back out of that Facebook K-hole for news, if that's where you're getting your news, the 40% of Australians who rely on that, to broaden our definition of what is newsworthy. And I guess that's another massive question.
There is a sort of an additional dimension to this, which is sort of brand affinity, for lack of a better term. And you'd have to say, Claire, at least from an Australian perspective, you'd be hard-pressed to find somebody who said it was a good PR stunt for Facebook in terms of at least public sentiment.
It was a massive own goal to be taking down the Bureau of Meteorology as we saw fires across the country. It was a massive own goal to have South Australia Health, ACT Health, the state and territory health department Facebook pages being taken offline, just as we're about to have a vaccine rollout, the swiftest and biggest vaccine rollout in the country's history. Poor move. And I think ever since Cambridge Analytica and some of the big privacy scandals the company has had, people have this very sort of difficult relationship with the platform. They know that it's baked into their lives, but they don't always love that. And so when this happened, when it was, we're not just taking your news, but there's this very blanket approach that has kind of knocked out a whole bunch of other pages, everyone immediately had a reason to kind of be annoyed at Facebook, and it was very easy to point to that and kind of ignore some of the bigger issues. So coming back to Australia, I was sort of wrapping my head around this code, having not been here for the development of it and, through the ACCC, them starting things off and trying to understand, who's paid what, who's got deals going with the different big tech companies. But if you look at what the 7 o'clock news is doing, the 2-minute piece that they're going to do, it was all about the sites that got pulled down. Suddenly the world didn't have access to news from Australia, which is incredibly disappointing. And suddenly Australians didn't have access to the day-to-day information that they need. And I think a lot of people had that reckoning of saying, oh, geez, maybe I need to stop being so reliant on one site.
Jocelyn, do you get a sense that people are, both individuals and also media companies, are recalibrating their relationship with Facebook right now?
Absolutely. I think we've been doing that since Cambridge Analytica, and if not that before. What I found really interesting about this was it was so blanket, given that they can twiddle lots of little dials to target us with advertising and all the logarithmic stuff that happens, yet they had such a blanket approach. And if you've watched The Social Dilemma, apparently there's two guys standing at some kind of control thing, operating what we're getting. Maybe being able to be a little bit more sensitive with this in order for them to make their point without that kind of own goal situation happening.
It's hard. As a journalist, I felt people kind of looking at it as a bit of a provincial story, saying, oh, look, what news is switched off in Australia? And I was like, actually, there's a lot of really interesting news coming out of Australia. Stories on the climate catastrophe. There's also stories on innovation. There's a lot that we have to tell, and shutting off Australia from the world isn't a good look. A lot of people who watch big tech watch what happens in other countries outside Silicon Valley because they can be the canaries in the coal mine, so to speak. One big example of that is security and privacy legislation. Australia is part of a group called the Five Eyes, which includes countries like the UK and the US. So big countries that set a lot of agendas on security. And Australia has brought in legislation in the past that then has been sort of used as precedent in that respect. So a lot of countries will be watching this to see how it plays out, because how Facebook manages news and what it allows on its platform is a really big question. And there are these dials and levers that can be pulled behind the scenes, but apparently Facebook wasn't pulling them. And I know one of the big stories that came out of this was, well, how did they allow the Christchurch shooting to go on Facebook, but suddenly they can turn off all news very quickly? That was a big question, people asking, what control do they have and how are they exercising that control?
All right, there is lots more of this in the podcast of Download This Show. You can find it wherever you get your podcasts. See ya.